Well, I want to welcome you all to the Oklahoma Council for Social Studies virtual conference. We have a session here by Stephanie Walger, who's the NCSS president and working with the OER project. And so I'm just going to go ahead and throw it over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. Appreciate being here. And I know when David was asking me sort of, what do you want to talk about? There's a few things near and dear to my heart, and one of those things is media literacy. So just wanted to spend a little time with you today thinking about, the implications for that, certainly broadly, but also in our classroom. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and we have some kind of stopping points throughout today, so we'll also have a chance for that. All right. I'm going to go to the next slide. Whenever I'm talking about media literacy in particular, I always want to start the conversation by sharing some norms, and I'm sure all of you do this in your classroom too. Media literacy is one of those things that can be very contentious, and even today, I'll share some examples that are sort of from both sides of the aisle, trying to be very balanced about things, but just wanted to offer these norms as we got started. So I don't need to read them to you, but basically the overall theme here is be respectful, commit to listening, and just really kind of be in the moment in what we're talking about. So as we're talking about what can be kind of a heavy topic, I love sharing this post from George Decay, and this was a few years ago, but April 1st, the only day of the year that people critically evaluate things they find on the internet before accepting them as true. And gosh, that is so true, at least in my own experience. We are so quick today to just sort of, share things without thinking about them. And of course, I'll be sharing some examples of that as we move throughout today's presentation. So I want to ground us in just like, what is media literacy when we say that? Because it's pretty popular these days to talk about financial literacy, media literacy, global literacy, and what does that exactly mean? So it's really the ability to do all of these things, which is a lot, to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media in a variety of forms, and the recognition, I think this is the most important part of the definition, that all media is constructed in some way. And we'll talk a little bit in just a minute about, what do we mean by constructed, and how does that sort of play into our own media literacy ability. So I'm going to pause and just have us think about this question, or if you're watching the recording, think about this question in your own classroom, but just how do you currently address media literacy in your own classroom, or it could be even in your own life, because I know in my family, I feel like I'm often teaching many courses on media literacy. People you might encounter online, you might feel like that. So just pause for just a minute and think about, how does this currently interact in your life? Okay, so hopefully you spend a little bit of time thinking about that. I think there's always spaces. So even if you teach, world history, right, or something that may seem like it has no connection to media literacy, there are always ways that you can teach students these skills of evaluating information, of thinking about, media literacy is not a new phenomenon, and we'll share some examples of that in later on in the presentation, that this did not just emerge, 8 years ago, 4 years ago. It has been a thing throughout history. So really finding those connections, I think, is super important. So I want to circle back to that idea of media being constructed. And I really like this graphic. I'm not sure if you can see it super well on your screen, but this idea of construction of media and intentions being really important. And so I always try to keep that in mind, because there could be an article from the most well-respected media source on the planet that could have an error in it, right? No human is perfect, and those things, certainly happen. But the intention behind the creation of that is really like a critical thing to talk to students about, and that all information is not created equal, right? So we'll talk later about the things that are out there where you can create fake tweets, you can create fake things to make them look like fake images, all these kinds of things. And obviously the intention behind that is probably not as positive as the intention behind a professional journalist with the New York Times or the AP or something like that. So I like this diagram because it really talks about like intent to harm versus like just misinformation. And we're not going to talk a lot about this today, but you can actually go and find like the journalist code of ethics, right? And talk to students about, if you're a tried and true journalist, these are the things that you're sort of committing to. And one of those things is when you realize that something was published that, is inaccurate, that you publish a correction to that you're holding your own self accountable for that. You'll also notice in here and in general, there's this movement away from trying to talk about fake news. we'll share some really fake examples towards the end, but there's this intention that we want to stop using that language, because it implies that there's like fake and then there's sort of everything else, and not this continuum of things. And so I will use that term some, but I just want to offer that caveat that we're really trying to move away from that. So another kind of pause and think, you'll notice that I do this a lot because I really hate like talking to people. I want it to be very interactive. So in 2019, the Pew Research Center found that over half of Americans either got their news sometimes or often from social media. And Facebook was the most popular social media site. Now, I don't think Facebook was created to be a news site or Twitter or any of those other kind of social media platforms. So I want you to just kind of think about, what do you wonder about this statistic? Like, it gave me a lot of pause when I was thinking about this. And I want you, the second part of that is to really think about what are the implications for media literacy, right? Because if we know that generally half of Americans, and I don't know the breakdown of like young people versus older folks, but if generally half of folks are getting their media from social media sites, which were not intended to really do that, what does that mean, and what are the implications of that? So think about that, and pause this recording for just a minute, and then we're going to move on to talking about sort of media bias and that continuum of thinking about media literacy. So you may have seen this chart before. Allsides.com publishes this chart, and I know it's a little bit tricky to probably see on your slide, but I have included the link there, and I will share the link to all these slides at the end. But they publish this chart every year, and one thing I should say about this chart is that they only do this for print content. It is not TV content. So that is just one little disclaimer that I would offer here. But I think it's a really interesting chart, at least to me, because it gives me pause of thinking about, okay, the kind of media or where I'm getting my media from. Are they on the far left column? Are they on the far right column? Or is it a combination? Am I being really purposeful about that? So I think it's just a good example of something to know, at least as the educator, but also to really have students kind of think about the implications of the kind of media that they are ingesting. So going along with that, because I think this is all kind of connected, one of the things that I am most fascinated about, and I think about this in particular with my own, I guess I would say family, like sharing personal stories here, but how much emotion plays into media literacy is really fascinating to me. And I think of it sort of kind of like, I guess, health literacy, right? Like I may know that the chocolate cake is really bad for me, but I might still choose to eat the chocolate cake, even if I know it's bad for me. Or in the case of the media bias chart, like I may know that something I'm watching is leaning, one way or the other, but that like gives me this sort of positive feedback if I'm listening to something that reinforces ideas that I believe in. So I think those, it's interesting to talk to students about this, probably high school students, because I'm sure that's not like that metacognition probably hasn't happened with them. And so just talking through this idea of like emotions trigger what's called hot cognition, which is just positive or negative feelings about the information that we're processing. And this often leads individuals to seek out evidence that aligns to their pre-existing views. So just what I was talking about a second ago, that would be confirmation bias, or to attempt to dismiss perspectives that contradict our own beliefs, which is disconfirmation bias. And so I think knowing that and then kind of having that ability to go, oh, I'm going to self-reflect about what I'm seeing, and if I'm constantly what I'm seeing is constantly reinforcing everything that I personally believe in, is that sort of dangerous, for myself. So just something to think about. And connected to that, a few years ago, and you may have seen this already, the Wall Street Journal did this really fascinating thing where they chose a few different topics and they essentially pulled news stories from different news sources and put them into what they called the blue feed, red feed. So here, I think this topic is immigration. And you can, if you go onto the site, you can actually then see the stories and show the contrast between how is sort of a liberal leaning media source talking about immigration versus a conservative news source, and it's same topic, right? So this is, I think, really, at least to me, interesting, and students that I've used it with have found this also really interesting, because I think oftentimes, and you could go into lots of detail about kind of how especially Facebook kind of leans, is set up, artificial intelligence is set up to show us things that we believe in, that we think that we are in agreement with, and how dangerous that can sometimes be. So I'm going to pause there and just see, I know we had somebody who joined us, and I want to make sure that I'm just pausing and giving you space, because you kind of, I didn't get a chance to introduce myself or anything like that. So I'll pause and just see if you have any questions so far.
No, not at all. And my name's Liz Rogers, and I'm the secretary for OCSS.
Hey, so Liz, thanks for joining. Yeah, and I love your picture. it's where I want to snow out my window, so I'm really wanting to be there too. All right, well, I'll go ahead and go on. I want to get in, this is kind of the teacher background side of things, and I'm sure that both of you probably have seen this particular study, so this is probably not new information. But essentially, our SHEG friends, our folks at the Stanford History Education Group, they've done a couple studies now, but they sampled experienced users of the internet, like professional fact checkers, historians, and Stanford history undergraduates. And what I found fascinating about this, and Peter and I we were talking about this earlier, but really the idea that the historical thinking skills didn't necessarily translate to media literacy skills. I found that to be fascinating, because before this I was like, yep, they're very much in the same. And that really didn't quite turn out to be true, right? Because in historical thinking, we're really teaching students to examine the document and to really uncover evidence from within the document, right? Where in media literacy, we're really teaching students to leave the document, leave the website, leave the image, and do some kind of what they call lateral reading. And so one of the things that they noticed from these professional fact checkers is that they did the lateral reading. They practiced click restraint. So when they looked something up, they didn't click on the first Google result that came up. And they really like charted a plan of how they were going to figure out what they needed to figure out, which I found really quite fascinating. So I want to walk through a few of those, and these I think are also really good to use with older students, high school students, giving them some of these tasks and kind of walking through like, can you figure out, is this a trustworthy source? So in this particular task, the students were, in the study, they were tasked with doing research on children's health and came across the website of the American College of Pediatricians. It's a live website. You can go there now. And the question posed, to these different groups were, is this a trustworthy source to learn about children's health? And if you're familiar with the study, lots of the students and the historians were like, essentially, yes, it looks good. It has a professional look to the website. Again, kind of applying those historical thinking skills that we know and love, but they never left the website. And most of them did not, to investigate like who owns that site, who's behind that site, etc. So even though it has a professional title and looks really nice, the American College of Pediatricians is not the nation's major professional organization of pediatricians. It's actually a very conservative advocacy organization established in 2002 after the long-standing professional organization for pediatricians, which we're probably familiar with, the American Academy of Pediatricians, came out in support of adoption for same-gender couples. So this group like broke off. And this group only has about 200 to 500 members, whereas the group that we know, the AAP, has about 64,000 members, right? But I would never have found that out if I hadn't had, left the website and gone to do this lateral reading to really investigate, who was behind the information. So I want to pause there and just kind of get your thoughts. Like, do you think that that is something that you might do in your own classroom and that would be helpful for students to kind of experience these sort of media literacy tasks on their own?
1,000%. So it's funny, while you were presenting, I was texting my district director of library and media services, and I was like, I'm gonna have a link for you, like you and your team are gonna watch it. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed. I mean, the current situation, political situation in our country is screaming for it, because you talked about the confirmation bias and people trying to find a source that agrees with them, and you don't really go deeper than, oh, well, there's a website that says this, but
I found something, right?
Yes.
Even if it was from like Joe the blogger, I found something that supported my idea, right?
Yep.
Thank you.
Sometimes I feel like if there's 100 studies, we go and purposely look for the one study or image that goes with our preconceived ideas of what we think the answer should be, and that we're not willing to do the research or understand the opposing viewpoints.
Yes.
And recognize them as valid as well.
Yeah, and I think, we know as social studies teachers, right, like all of these issues are so complex. It's not something that, like, I can't reply with a quick meme or something to somebody online or on social media that's gonna like satisfy the answer. And that's why, having discourse about these things, asking students, Peter and you were talking about claims of evidence and reasoning, like so important, because, and those are all really complex things, right? Those are not simple simple things. And so I think that's what also makes it, more challenging for us as social studies teachers, right? That all of this takes a lot of time. There aren't simple answers. There's a lot to unpack here. So I know for time's sake, I'm gonna skip through a few things, but I want to share with you the results in the study was that half of the college students failed to investigate beyond, the website. Essentially, there's a great clip from Sam Weinberg here about, essentially like what they found in the study. And then just some quotes that probably don't surprise you, but just, hear what the students said. It's trustworthy because it doesn't have ads, right? It had it like a .org, I believe. It's well designed. So, they're using like some of those, and Sam Weinberg talks about this, moving away from checklists. You've probably all seen like the CRAP checklist, there's all sorts of acronym checklists out there. Essentially, like the advice from our civic online reasoning friends at SHAG is don't use those because almost all of them, the websites that they gave students to really evaluate would have passed, the CRAP test because they never left the website to go investigate. And so, yeah, I think I talk about that later on as well, but that's just an important kind of key there, is to try to move away from those checklist kinds of things. Here's another one that you could use, really interesting video. Like I immediately picked up when I watched this, and I'll just play a second of it. This doesn't look like it's the United States if you just kind of look at the surroundings, but it was posted on iOnFlix, and it's supposedly precincts in Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Arizona, and claiming that there was voter fraud in the Democratic primary election. So I'll play just a second of that, and hopefully it will cooperate, or it won't. Okay, I don't know why it's not cooperating. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. And there isn't any sound, it's just the, so that's where the supposed sort of ballot box stuffing is coming from. Okay, I'll fast forward ahead. Again, you see the supposed ballot stuffing. Okay, now did anyone catch anything just from looking at that seemed a little off? Like just a normal, like if I went in to vote in most states in the US, did that look like what I would experience when
it didn't look like it to me. It looked like she had multiple ballots all at once. It looked like a huge stack of paper.
Right.
And to be able to shove it in the box, that it looked like it was a little bit more difficult. I mean, I've never had a ballot that's more than one page. So.
Right. And even the I guess the box didn't look like what most places, most places have some kind of machine, or it's a secure, you can't usually see through it. Like this looked like a garbage bag sort of thing where they were just putting things in. So there were lots of things. And if you watch the whole thing, you'd probably pick up on some more things too. But again, just having students look at that and trying to, pick up on some of those pieces. And so let's go to look at where that actually came from. But 60% of high school students said, yep, looks like ballot stuffing to me. This video was actually a video that the BBC had a story about, and the headline of that story was "Russian Voting Fraud Caught on Webcam." So these are all actually scenes from Russia. And I think there's one clip of the film, if you're looking closely, where you can see some language other than English. So that would be another, clue to zone in on that. And then another clue, which we didn't even talk about, but is of course the Eye on Flicks person that supposedly posted it. What credibility do they have? Did I find this same video on, reputable news sites? That kind of thing. So I don't want to leave without talking about truly fake news. Even though I said at the beginning, I try to really avoid that term because we really want to talk about the intentions behind the news. But I also want to, really say fake news is not a new phenomenon. And so this image was actually in an article that was in Social Education a few years ago that was put up as a billboard claiming Martin Luther King was attending a communist training school, and it was sponsored by the States' Rights Council. And I found it really interesting, just because, again, to think about, I think we sometimes think of media literacy as a new phenomenon, but certainly it is not, and is actually a picture of Dr. King at the Highlander Folk School at Mount Eagle in the 1940s. So he's not at a communist training school, but the States' Rights Council put it up as a billboard, making that claim. And in 1965. And so just thinking about, gosh, we've really been dealing with this issue and far before this even, but I think connecting that idea that this is not a new phenomenon with students is also really important. So let's take another look at another example here. When we think about, is this real or fake? And this is one of my favorites. A picture that, and you can see from what they posted, believe it or not, this is a shark on the freeway in Houston, Texas. Now, let's think about if we were doing this with students and ask students, could we figure out if this is real or fake? What do you think students would do or would say?
I think a lot of students at this point understand Photoshop, and so I think quite a few would go, yeah, that's Photoshop. But there are some who might really wonder, like, well, it was a hurricane, and there was Sharknado. So
yes. So, and you can tell, and I circled this on purpose. Look at how many times that was retweeted. And people commented and liked it. 77,000. Now I post things about like the importance of social studies and I get like 20 likes, right? So it just is stunning to me that, not only did they spell Hurricane Harvey wrong, so they didn't even use the right hashtag, but shared 77,000 times. And there's a concept in media literacy called like clean up the pollution, essentially. And essentially the idea is that it's all of our responsibility to try to point out when we see something that is fake. So even if it's something as innocuous as, the freeway shark, we really want to try to address that and say, hey, it's not cool sharing this, because obviously a good percentage of those 77,000 people thought that this was real. And that just tells you kind of how disturbing it is. Here's another example. You see images, of course, as you just said, Peter, like lots of, it's easiest, right, to alter images. But the real image is on the right of Tom Hanks in the soccer jersey. And you can kind of tell if you look at the picture at the right angle that the other image, seems photoshopped. And you've probably seen these ads on Facebook of like celebrities wearing different shirts. And oftentimes, they're doing that to try to, sell the shirt, but Tom Hanks didn't really, wasn't really wearing that shirt, at least not on that day. Same thing here with LeBron James. And there's literally thousands of examples of these things. Another example that I would say, and you probably already know this as well, but there are lots of fake news generators, unfortunately, right? Because obviously some folks think, this is really fun. And so this Donald Trump tweet wasn't a tweet. It was a fake tweet that was created using one of those fake news generators. And, again, shared, as you can tell here, 6.7 thousand times retweeted, and then 17,000 likes for something that wasn't real. And I equate this sometimes, like if you've ever been on jury duty and the judge says, please disregard what you just heard, that's really hard to do. Right? Once you've heard this, or you thought that this was said, or you thought that Tom Hanks, wore that shirt, it's really hard to sort of unsee that or unthink about it in your brain. And I think that's another problem with media literacy. When you hear that enough times, or see that enough times, it's hard to get out of your mind that, hey, perhaps that's, not true. One resource that I would recommend sharing with students, if you're not familiar with this, it's relatively new. It's called spotthetroll.org. And essentially they have you go through Twitter profiles and try to determine, is this person a real person or is this person a bot? And so this is one of the examples on Spot the Troll, and really great to use, take away right in the classroom. And it looks really real when you're looking at it. So this is Harmony Anderson. I chose her because she is supposedly from Iowa, where I live, and you can see how many followers she has and how many people she's following. And you can see some other, I just screenshotted, essentially all of the slides that you would see, or I'm sorry, the images that you would see if you were going through Spot the Troll here. So you can see that she's tweeted about Melania Trump, really into her fashion. She's got some videos here of Joe Biden, the famous sort of, I think, Barbara Walters interview with President Trump. But unfortunately, she is actually a troll attributed to the Russian Internet Research Agency. And so my folks over at the News Literacy Project, they actually realized that or figured that out somehow and worked with Twitter to have her account suspended. And what's really cool about this particular Spot the Troll resource is that they tell you after each sort of Twitter personality, whether it's real or fake, but if they're fake, they tell you how did they figure that out and how did that get discovered. And I think that is the most interesting part, certainly for teachers and students to engage in. And one of those things is that rarely the Twitter bots will post, actual personal information. So if you looked at all the pieces here, it was often just reshares of things. There weren't a lot of original tweets, it was a lot of political things only. So they talk about, some of those kind of look-fors when you're trying to determine a Twitter bot. And I'll share, I put together a media literacy toolkit that I'll share at the end of this that walks through some really cool websites where you can actually put in somebody's Twitter handle and there's an algorithm that figures out, or at least takes a guess about whether that person is a bot based off of how they've posted things or a real person. So there are some good tools out there to help you figure that out. Okay, so the other really scary part of this continuum is using artificial intelligence to create fake videos. So I don't know if you've seen this video before, but I'm gonna play it. Hopefully. I know we had a little bit.
It got me thinking about my full-time employees and their ability to survive on $8 an hour in New York City. And foremost in all of our minds has been the loss and the grief felt by the people of Orlando. Most of us don't get our health care through the marketplace. We get it through our job, or through Medicare or Medicaid. And what you should know is that thanks to the Affordable Care Act, your coverage is better today than it was before. Women can get.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop there. I don't know if anybody's seen that before, but I just think that is over the top, like crazy to think about that videos can now be faked by, you know, just sort of having audio from other videos and using the like the mapping model of the mouth to make it look like he's saying those words when he's really not. So obviously that is going to be much harder to determine whether it's fake than an image or text along the continuum. But just teaching students that that is a possibility, right? That even videos can be fake to make it look like someone is saying something that they're not. So I don't want to leave without sharing some kind of key takeaways. And one of the biggest ones I already talked about, and that is read laterally. And I think you guys know what that means, but leave the website, leave the image, you know, do something outside of that to try to figure out who's behind the information, what is the evidence for the claims that they're making, what do other sources, you know, say about this issue. One of the things that our Stanford History Education Group folks say is really embrace Wikipedia, which I know sometimes sounds like a strange tip, but especially when we're looking for like who is behind the information, oftentimes Wikipedia has at least a lead on that information, and so can be a really helpful tool. So don't forget about that. Certainly becoming discerning customers of search engine results, not clicking on that first thing that pops up in Google when we're looking for information. And then I think like one of the biggest tips, which oftentimes people don't know, and I'm going to go, let me reshare my screen just a second, because I don't think you can see that, is to do a reverse image search. And so this is really easy to do if you are in Google. And here is back to our shark picture. And so if you're in Google Chrome, really easy to right click on an image. So this works on Facebook too, as long as you're in Chrome, and you can see where it says search Google for image. And so if I do that, and I think you probably always know that you can come to Google and click on images. I use that all the time, but you probably didn't know you could do a reverse image search. And so I can, when I do that reverse image search, similar images or that exact image, you know, comes up in this case, and I can immediately see that shark photo is fake, right? And, you know, obviously this is a pretty simple example, but for the most part, it works pretty well. Or you can see if, you know, an article doesn't pop up saying it's fake, because that's probably unlikely. You can see, you know, where did that image first appear on the internet? Like, is this a new image? It oftentimes will show you similar images. So for example, somebody that I know on Facebook shared an image of somebody at a rally holding a sign. Signs are often doctored. And so I just did a reverse image search on it, and there was a picture of a lady at a rally holding a sign, but it didn't say what was shared on Facebook. It was a totally different image or different words on the sign than what my friend had shared. And I only knew that because I had done this reverse image search. So really like a simple but profound tool. If you weren't already familiar with that, I just highly recommend teaching students how to do that. If you're not in Chrome, but you just go to Google, you can either, you know, save the image and drag it to Google to do this. You know, so there's other ways to do it. It doesn't have to just be the right click if you're not in Google Chrome. So let me finish by this part by saying, you know, make sure you're going beyond the checklist like I talked about earlier. We don't want to rely on, you know, just asking students to do the CRAP test or the acronym thing. we really want to teach some of these other skills, and lots of great resources are out there to help kind of build up some of these skills, which I will share. One that was put together by Elk Grove Digital Citizenship site is just a quick poster for students on this idea of lateral reading. So I included the link to that, so you will have access to that. And then these guiding principles, we've talked about a lot of these as we've gone throughout the session today, but all information is not fake, right? And we really want to study examples of exemplary journalism, and there's some great lessons on this. Like, let's look at what journalists have to go through, right, to meet those ethical journalistic guidelines versus like what does somebody who's just blogging, on their own personal site, like what do they have to go through? And let's weigh, kind of the evidence here of the process, but also recognizing that even the greatest journalist, ever can make mistakes, and that and that just if they made a mistake does not mean that that whole thing is fake news. News is distinct from other forms of information. So thinking about this range of news, I think is important. People tend to see what they want in the media, right? And going back to what we talked about confirmation and disconfirmation bias. And then this one I already talked about, but it's my favorite one. Like, it's all of our jobs to try to like clean up the pollution, even though sometimes that can be uncomfortable. And then really that last one, just trying to develop this set of tools to tackle the sources and tackle, tackle media literacy as both as an adult and as a classroom teacher. So I would kind of close out, and then I'll share some of these other resources. I have been thinking about this a lot. This quote from Timothy Snyder. He has a book called On Tyranny. And he was on, I think it was a Sunday morning with Fareed Zakaria, I want to say, is where I heard him talk about this. But he talked about how being in a post-truth world is being in a pre-fascist world. And that just really like stood out to me as profound in how like our role as social studies teachers, we have a lot of weight on our shoulders, because it really is our role to educate, not only our current citizens, but, really the next generation of citizens. And so media literacy plays such a huge part in that. And when we're in a post-truth environment, that's sort of the next, I guess, stage is what he's saying, essentially, to fascism. So we won't do our Pear Deck slide, but just in, kind of any reflections of just like a takeaway from today's session.
I just think this reinforces to me the necessity of being intentional in how we talk about this. And I appreciate the tips that you have for being able to check that, and some of the strategies. I've already shared spotthetroll.org with my department chairs after you mentioned it. I'm like, oh, here's a website. So I think those things are really important, because many teachers can identify, yeah, there's false information out there. We need to be able to sift through this information, but then it's the how piece that gets a lot of people. So the resources stand out to me, and I appreciate that. And I know the people in my district would as well.
Thank you. All right, I'll leave with some other goodies, and I will share the link to the PowerPoint as well. But probably about 6 months ago, I created this media literacy toolkit, and I actually created it because I was working with a group of state librarians, and they were very concerned about you know, how do we help like the general public deal with this? And so since then I've tweaked it a little bit to be more kind of teacher friendly, but the idea is kind of a combination of like a mini course, I guess, on media literacy with some of these tools sprinkled throughout, kind of in a workbook, resource, you know, whatever, and it's interactive. So all the links are live links. So you can, you know, you can come in here and like watch the little videos and, you know, videos on lateral reading, all of the, you know, here's Spot the Troll again. Here's our Bot Sentinel is one of those resources I talked about to put in somebody's Twitter handle and see, you know, does this seem like a legitimate person or, you know, not so much. So, so I leave you with that link, and then I will share there's some additional resources in here that have not made their way into the media literacy toolkit piece. But the big one I would highlight here is if you're not already subscribed to the Sift newsletter from the News Literacy Project. They have a newsletter, I think it's every other week or every week, that kind of sifts through the top kind of true or untrue viral news stories from the week, and then gives some, you know, teacher ideas of how to address these. That's just one of my favorite things because they do all the work and I don't have to spend as much time on that. And then here is the link to the slide. So if you want all of those active links, this is a bit.ly link, and I can also minimize and type that into the chat box. So any questions? I think I'm maybe right at time. So maybe I didn't go over too much. Any questions?